In the variety streamer community, bad video game opinions are considered especially heinous. In the graveyard, the dedicated streamer who gives these wretched takes is known only as Kyria Thanatos. All opinions in this broadcast belong solely to the streamer. This is Post-Mortem.
Hey everybody, welcome to Post-Mortem. This is going to be a show where I talk about the games that I played this week and how I feel about them, the game design, the level design, the themes, really whatever I want to talk about with the games. You can think of it kind of like a video podcast, I guess, although I'm not a podcaster, don't call me a podcaster. But it's mostly just an excuse for me to sort of get my thoughts and feelings out on the things I played and, sort of speak my piece about them. And I played a lot of really good games this week because it is the first week of the Midnight Massacre. So I've been really enjoying the things that I've been playing this week. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the first thing that I played this week, which was Anatomy. And Anatomy is a game that I have played before. It is one of my favorite horror games of all time. There's so much to say about it, and I've said so much about it before in now both of my playthroughs. But really, I think what sticks out to me the most in Anatomy is that there's this building sense of dread the whole time. But there's never actually like a scare until almost the very end where the house eats you. There's not really a scare before that. It is a game that asks a lot of interesting questions and juxtaposes a lot of interesting things against each other. But it's a game that doesn't actually have scares. You're just walking around listening to tapes for almost all of it. Which I understand how that could be boring for some people. But personally, I think it might be one of the best horror games ever made. Because it asks us to think of our homes as places that are alive, with an ecosystem that revolves around you. With a body, with a heart, with a soul, with a mind. With eyes, with teeth, with fangs bared, angry that you've left it alone. Right? And I think more specifically, the most interesting question that it asks is what happens to a house when it's abandoned? What happens to a house when it's left to rot, right? And the intense pain that causes it as a living being. Because nothing wants to be abandoned and nothing wants to be left alone to rot, right? But whereas if you or I were left alone to rot, we can do something about it. A house can't. It simply has to sit there and wonder through clenched teeth, as it says in the game, wonder through clenched teeth, what did I do wrong? What did I do to deserve this? And the answer is probably nothing. In fact, the answer is almost assuredly nothing. The house did nothing wrong. It's just how things have happened. But I think, especially in this playthrough, the thing that I noticed that I like about it the most is there's a really interesting juxtaposition between what we think of with a house. We think of a house as a sacred place almost. You're safe in your house, right? If you are scared about something in the world, that you're going to get mugged or something, right? Or you're going to get hurt somehow. Maybe you're afraid of COVID, something like that, right? Your house is a safe place. Your house is the place where you can't get hurt. When you're inside, you can't be hurt anymore. I mean, that's why so many horror movies take place inside of people's homes. Because it's scary when your house is no longer a safe place. Well, Anatomy asks you, was your house ever a safe place to begin with? More specifically, it asks you, what does it mean if a house is abandoned? Because we don't think of a house as something that can be abandoned. Obviously, we know that a house can be abandoned in the sense that nobody lives in it anymore. But we think of a house as something sacred and safe that can't be abandoned in the sense that you would abandon a person. But what if it can? And what does that mean? And I think ultimately it's telling this really interesting story about abandonment and just the intense pain that causes. How much it hurts to be abandoned, how much it hurts to be left alone. So I know that Anatomy personally, from having seen things the dev has said, Anatomy is inspired a lot by The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, in that it is a house that is not just alive, but is almost actively plotting against you because it's angry, because it doesn't like the way that you've treated it and it doesn't like what you've done to it. And I really loved that book, and I really loved the Netflix series that came out of that. I think there's really a lot to like about Anatomy. I think there's a lot to say about Anatomy. And, I would have more to say in this section, but I have already played it twice, and I've given my thoughts both times, and it's just such a good game. It's just such a good game. So Silent Hill 3, to me, was a really interesting game. It's not one that I found initially compelling, but it is one that the longer I played it, and especially the days that I've had to think about it since then, it has become more compelling, and it's kind of sat in my mind a little bit. When I went to the store the other night at 1 a.m., that's not something that usually scares me. That's not something that I was afraid of before. But Silent Hill 3 so uniquely focuses on feminine fears of many things, of pregnancy, of abandonment, of trauma, of so many other things that are in a very uniquely feminine way. But like one of the things that it focuses on is the fear of being alone in the dark in a public place. The fear of walking home late at night and not knowing if you are going to be hurt that night or something. Silent Hill 3 is a game that focuses on that sort of stuff, and it scared me. I didn't have that fear before, and when I was walking around at 1 a.m. the other night, I was terrified. I was looking around, I was checking every corner, I was afraid that something was going to get me. And I think that that is a good encapsulation of the way that Silent Hill 3 has lived in my head since I played it. Like I said, it is a game uniquely about feminine fears, and a lot of those fears initially flew over my head. I can't get pregnant. I'm a trans woman. I didn't grow up having a lot of the fears that cis women have instilled in me. I wasn't afraid of walking around in the dark. I don't have pregnancy scares. I don't have to worry about periods. There's a lot of things that are in this game that flew over my head because I don't have to worry about them. They're things that don't initially scare me. But with Silent Hill 3, I initially thought that a lot of those fears flying over my head was going to be something that made the game not as fun for me, not as interesting for me, but they really do the more I think about them. And I think a lot of that comes down to how well designed a lot of the game is. The sound design, the monster design, the story, Heather. So much of the game is really immaculately designed, including Heather's facial expressions. I remember those really popping out to me, and the music does as well. It's this almost sort of like poppy music that you haven't heard in the other Silent Hill games, especially in Silent Hill 2, which is this, very sad, somber OST. Whereas this one is very poppy, very happy, very excitable in some ways, tinged with the Silent Hill melancholy and horror. But the thing that I remember the most about Silent Hill 3, and the thing that has stuck with me the most, is that Heather is this character who is just really fun and really personality driven and just incredibly interesting to play as, right? Her loneliness is really relatable, and this idea that she is this vessel that everybody is trying to use, whether or not they're trying to birth their own god or a redemption for themselves, or through Henry, how he is trying to have a surrogate daughter through her. Heather is a vessel for everybody else's desires. They don't let her be her own person because she's a vessel for them and what they want. And I think that it makes her this really compelling and relatable character for anybody. But I think I relate to her in a lot of ways where, as a trans woman, I feel a bit cast out from society the same way that she is, being this sort of like weirdo child that, by all rights shouldn't exist. And I think the game really plays into that in a really fun and interesting way. It's just a shame then that so many parts of the game feel like wasted potential. Pretty much as soon as you get to the hospital, the game tries to pull itself back into its own Silent Hill overarching narrative between it and the first one, and I really thought it starts to go downhill there a little bit. The hospital section just felt very bad to me. For a game that's all about pregnancy and, a bodily autonomy and that sort of thing, right? There are sections in the hospital that's really good, but it doesn't feel like that uses those effectively. Now, again, I do just want to say there are some really good sections in the hospital. Heather at one point says that she doesn't like mirrors in the beginning if you look at one of the mirrors in the mall, because she doesn't like to see herself, because it feels like the person looking back at her is somebody that she doesn't recognize and could be anybody, right? And of course, this is a subtle nod to the other world, but it's a pretty relatable thing, right? To not like what you're seeing in the mirror. And then Silent Hill takes this a step more literally, and there is a room with a giant mirror, and if you stand in it and stare at it long enough, the other world will come through and start to sort of go all over Heather. If you stay in there long enough, you'll start to die. You'll start to be hurt by your own reflection. You have to leave. which is a really cool scene. There's also the love letters that you get from Stanley, and he spends the whole game stalking you. And again, this sort of goes into the uniquely feminine fears that the game is full of, because you never visually see him, not until he's already a body under a drape as part of a puzzle. But it doesn't make him any less creepy, and in fact, I would say it makes him more creepy, because not being able to see him makes him this overpowering presence. The most you can ever do is hear him. There are sounds in the game, sort of a loud banging sound in the background, like a door closing. And I always thought that was just the ambiance of the hospital, but it's actually Stanley. He's following you around and closing the doors behind you. And I think that makes him a really compelling and interesting character to follow Heather around, right? To play this sort of like stalking man role that, you know, even he's using her as a vessel. This man who's never seen her, will never meet her, and who the player never meets, even he uses her as a vessel for his own sexual gratification. Heather is truly a vessel to everybody that isn't herself. And I think that's just really interesting. So the hospital has some really good parts like that, but then for a game so much about pregnancy and that sort of thing, you would think that the hospital would feature that more. Why don't the nurses have, like, why aren't they more focused on trying to create a pregnancy in you, right? Like trying to birth you or something. Why is the other world in the hospital so much more focused on blood and that sort of body horror than it is the body horror of pregnancy itself, of, you know, the pain and the you know, spread leg motif and all the other sort of thing that it could have gone with. I just feel like the hospital would be a great place to really delve into the pregnancy stuff. Like, it's not like the game is exactly subtle in the first place. No Silent Hill really is. So I feel like the hospital could have been used in these really interesting ways to show pregnancy. Aside from the walls being coated in some sort of fluid that vaguely resembles an amniotic sac and a potentially fetal heartbeat you can hear, the hospital doesn't really feel like it goes into that too much. Doesn't really feel like it actually does anything all that interesting with the concept, which is just a little sad. And then, you know, you have like the final boss of the area, which is Leonard. Leonard doesn't feel like a character that affects anything. He should be really important because he's Claudia's abusive dad. He should be a character that's really important, but abusive dads don't really play a role in Silent Hill 3. There's some interesting ideas you could say where Heather has a pretty good dad for all things considered, and Claudia has an abusive dad, and Claudia and Heather being sort of two people who experience the same thing but going through and reacting to it in different ways. It kind of makes for a very interesting, like, well, Heather had a good dad, she had a bad dad, Claudia had a bad dad, but I don't think it builds on that enough for it to really be interesting. So Leonard just kind of feels like this character that's out of place. I mean, I think the game sums up itself on the hospital best, because as soon as you're done with the hospital, Heather goes,
Leonard's not here anymore. I guess I should head back to the motel now.
Like, she doesn't really have anything interesting to say about the hospital. She just kind of leaves. There's nothing interesting to say or anything to think about. You know, Leonard carrying the medallion of Metatron, which you end up not even using. I mean, I understand that's like a plot relevant thing, but Leonard carrying the medallion doesn't even really seem like it comes up. It just doesn't feel good. But overall, I think Silent Hill 3 was an incredible game. Hospital section aside, I mean, even including the hospital section, it's still like a 9 out of 10 for me. Like, it's a game that's really gonna stick with me for a long time. If nothing else, you know, that banger soundtrack is going to keep me engaged. Mostly, I think it's a game that is really good and is really interesting. It just falls flat in the end. And speaking of things that fall flat in the end, Resident Evil 7. Boy, Resident Evil 7 was a video game. Let me tell you, I really, really liked Resident Evil 7, even including the ending, which sucked, and the ending half, rather, which sucked. I really enjoyed Resident Evil 7. The first half is incredible. Maybe one of the best games I've played, best horror games I've played in years. It's clearly this big B-movie horror inspiration, right? It's funny, because Resident Evil 7 was billed as going back to the series' roots. And I think for a lot of people, they thought that meant going back to the things that made RE1, RE2, RE3, like the original, sort of fun and interesting in terms of game design and map design and that sort of stuff. And I don't think that's really what they went off of. I don't think that's really what mattered. What I think really mattered is understanding that ultimately, Resident Evil has always been a playable B movie. Resident Evil has always been a playable Evil Dead, a playable Night of the Living Dead, right? Resident Evil has always been a schlocky, silly, terrifying, but somewhat silly horror B movie. And the inspirations for that are so clear in Resident Evil 7. I mean, the game developers talk on Resident Evil 7. They talked about specifically being inspired by Evil Dead, like a lot. And it shows. I mean, your hand gets cut off. There's a chainsaw battle. I believe Ethan even says groovy when you get the chainsaw. There's so much Evil Dead influence, and it's great. It's fantastic. I mean, I could just be saying this as a big film buff, but it is fantastic. It feels so good to play. It feels like a playable horror B movie in such a good way, and every area is segmented to be this really interesting, different type of B movie. Jack is a slasher movie, right? Jack is Freddy, he's Jason Voorhees, he's Michael Myers. He's every slasher that you've ever seen, you know, busting through the wall and terrifying the shit out of you, and just constantly around you. You know, the most scary thing about Jack is that you can run, you can hide, you can shoot at him, you can fight him, but he doesn't even really seem to mind getting shot at. He seems to think it's kind of funny. And that, I think that makes him a really interesting and compelling, like, villain, right? But then he's not the only one, because then you get to Marguerite, and she seems like this doddering old woman who's really easy to avoid. Really, like, I didn't take her seriously at all. I remember specifically saying while I was playing that I didn't think she was scary, and saying, like, sorry, you're just really not getting to me. Bugs don't really scare me that much, because they don't. As soon as you beat her and you think, oh, okay, well, that wasn't all that hard, she becomes this terrifying monster that stalks you, right? You are prey now. Her boss fight is entirely about her walking around the house, or the outhouse or camp house, or whatever you want to call it, the lake house, constantly stalking you and fighting you and jumping on you from the rooftops and creating her little, like, sacks and stuff. Not only is it an incredibly fun fight, but it really preys on the fear of you are the prey, you are being hunted, you are the meal tonight, and she is the predator. She is stalking you. She is exhaustively running you out of options until you are what she's going to feast on tonight. You know, and that's not even to get into the Metroidvania design of the game, which, to be fair, Resident Evil has always had a pretty big Metroidvania design, even before that was a thing. Resident Evil has always had a very Metroidvania-esque design in the early ones, and this one is no exception. The segmented doors, the art-based puzzles, they are fun and they're very Resident Evil, but they also lead into the house being, like, you know, having these multiple doors that you can't get and can't go through until you come back with an upgrade later. You know, it makes the whole thing feel this really fun to explore mechanically. You know, combine that with, like, how fun the shooting is, how fun the gameplay is, how good the nemesis are. The first half is just incredible. Even the parts with the very Saw-inspired Lucas, which is another movie inspiration, which I found slightly less compelling than the other two, are still really good. I mean, ultimately, what you do in Lucas's section is half of it's not really in Lucas's section. You play half of it through a tape, see how you could fail the puzzle, then learn that you can survive the puzzle if you do XYZ. And I think that that's really fun and interesting and good, sure. All of that is not as interesting, I think, as Jack or Marguerite is, but mostly, you know, even including him, I think all of the first half of Resident Evil 7 is incredible, is amazing, is just one of the best horror games I've ever played. And then it gives you a Sophie's choice between two characters who haven't been developed and you feel barely any compulsion to, and who effectively don't matter to you at all, and then acts like that's a big deal? It's weird. The first half is so inspired by movies, you know, slasher films, Evil Dead, Saw. It's so inspired by movies. And then the back half just seems to be, what if little girl was scary? As soon as you find Mia and Zoe, after you've beaten Jack for the last time, which we'll get to that, but after you've beaten Jack for the last time, you find Mia and Zoe, and then you're asked to choose between one of them for a cure, and that determines your ending. And ultimately, I chose Mia because that feels like the only choice that you can make, given that you have spent the whole game trying to go find her, and that was your whole motivation for the whole game. Ultimately, it doesn't feel like a choice that matters at all. Zoe and Mia are just not characters that are developed in any way, shape, or form. Mia is developed in the beginning somewhat by showing that she's mind controlled and then she cuts off your hand, which weirdly enough, as I found out, a lot of players refused to forgive her for that. A lot of players apparently chose Zoe because Mia cutting off your hand was an unforgivable act, even though she very clearly didn't know what she was doing. But oh well, whatever. I mean, the choice between the two of them just feels silly to me. Mia is slightly more developed. Zoe, you are meeting for the first time physically when you were asked to choose between her or Mia. She's helped you on the phone a couple of times. She staples your hand back together, but it doesn't really feel like she's a character outside of that. She just is the lady on the phone who guides you sometimes. She doesn't really have a personality besides being the lady on the phone who guides you sometimes and clearly knows more than you do. That's it. I felt no compulsion to pick her, and I feel like her character had not really been fleshed out. And then I was hoping in the End of Zoe DLC it would be more fleshed out, but it really isn't, as she spends that entire DLC asleep and admittedly in a very hot outfit, but otherwise asleep and not talking. But End of Zoe actually brings me to one of my only other problems with the game besides the latter half being just so bad, and that is that Jack is an incredibly effective and incredibly good enemy. Then his repeated deaths and then coming back in End of Zoe for a yet another death, they start to drain on you, and they start to really remove the sense of fear that I had with the character. Each time he gets scarier and bigger and meaner, but having him die repeatedly over and over again makes him almost become comical in a way that really diminishes how interesting he is. It's fun to punch him to death as One Punch Uncle Joe, right? It's fun to fight him. It's fun to fight his big monster form as Ethan. It's fun to run away from him as you roam the house. The boss fight with him in the garage is incredible and, you know, is a great set piece. No matter how it goes, it feels like you don't have the upper hand, you know, having replayed it both ways. Whether you get in the car and run him over a bunch or he gets in the car and tries to run you over, never really feels like you have the upper hand against him. But he, you know, by the time I saw him in End of Zoe, I didn't feel that connected to him at all. I didn't feel that scared of him at all. I was just ready to kick his ass, which maybe is sort of the point of End of Zoe, but doesn't feel like it does a lot for the character other than kind of flanderizing him within his own game. And also, End of Zoe brings me back to another point, which is the ending of the game. Because End of Zoe does exactly what the end of the game does, and it's try to connect it all back to the RE timeline. And it's funny because the game up until that point had been so disconnected from Resident Evil that it almost could have just been a separate entity all its own. It didn't need to be connected back to Resident Evil because it was more fun and better executed when it wasn't and didn't have the baggage of the series hanging over it and all of its silly, weird Umbrella, Neo Umbrella, Blue Umbrella, Tricell, zombie outbreak, Africa virus, Atlantis City baggage hanging over it, right? Because as soon as it tries to do that, as soon as you make the choice with Mia and Zoe, you then play as Mia for, I think, probably about 2.5 hours and learn everything you can about Evelyn, the antagonist who's secretly been the mold person this whole time. And you learn everything you can about Umbrella in some ways. I mean, it's not directly stated to be Umbrella, but it's kind of implied that it's all related to this like bioweapon or, you know, BOW program that Lucas is like selling her to and all this other sort of stuff. There's a lot of things you learn in that section that are lore-wise very interesting, but it really feels like a letdown because the entire section on the boat is just, scary girl pops in your face and goes, "Boo." It's just not interesting. It's not fun. It doesn't lead back into the series in a interesting way. It's just not very good. And then at the end, you know, the ending is just you. It's a very cool sequence visually, but you just mostly in a scripted fight stab Evelyn with a big syringe, and then the grossest version of Chris just comes and goes, "Hi, I'm Chris." It's just not that fun. It is a game that is a genuine 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 even in the first half. And then the second half is so bad and so boring and feels like it throws all of the interesting scares out the window and everything that made the game fun and scary and interesting out the window, to the point that it brings it down to like an 8 out of 10 or something, which is still a great score for a AAA game, but it's a shame because it could be so much better. Which, finally, leads me to Dead Space 2. And boy, am I excited to talk about this one. Dead Space 2 is a better game than Dead Space 1. I'm gonna repeat that. Dead Space 2 is a better game than Dead Space 1. In almost every way. I think the main difference between Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 that I noticed this time is that Dead Space 1 is tense. Dead Space 2 is stress. And this is even reflected in their openings. Dead Space 1 starts with this, 15-minute opening where you're on the ship, approaching the Ishimura, talking about it. You get on the Ishimura, things feel off, but you're not quite sure what's going on. You know, there's this constant building weird dread, constantly building. And then finally, it explodes into the crescendo of the necromorphs coming out and attacking you and you running from one, and etc., etc. Dead Space 2 starts like that a little bit. It starts with a little bit of tension with the interview with the guy who is asking you all these questions, right? But where it seems like it's going to build tension, where Franco comes out to talk to you and is telling you, hey, Isaac, you're Isaac, right? You got to get up. We got to get out of here. Immediately. And then just sets you loose in a section where, as I learned this playthrough, you can die. You are 100% in danger. It's not a scripted sequence. You can die. And you have to run out immediately. You're not scared. You already know what a necromorph is. It's not really that scary for you, but it is stressful. Oh, it's stressful as hell. And the whole game is built on that stress. From that moment on, the game never relents. It never gives up. Every ally you have is somebody who you don't think you can totally trust. Every room is filled to the brim and back with necromorphs. Just because the Sprawl, the station that this takes place on, is a civilian city. It's like a lived-in place, so there are more people, and there are varied people. There are children, there are babies, there are giant, amalgamations of multiple necromorphs that have turned into one giant beast. There are sections where you have to halo jump from an orbital station to another part of the station because it's just that big. It is a huge game. And it is a game that uses its environment to make you consistently stressed out. Ironically, maybe the only time you get to breathe and the only area that doesn't have that many enemies is when you return to the Ishimura, which is incredible and feels, it's funny. I think that was when I realized that the game was about stress and not tension, because the Ishimura feels tense. You come back to the Ishimura and it is tense. It is weird. It is scary. I despite not being afraid of the necromorphs anymore, these sections still made me feel uncomfortable. The section made me clench my legs together and be like, oh no, what's gonna happen, right? It's still effective all these years later. The Ishimura is, the set piece is like this place full of like tension where it's this cramped ship and you have no idea what's going on. And you would think that it would feel like a reprieve from the stress of the Sprawl being this big open thing where you're attacked by hordes and hordes and hordes of necromorph, but it's not. It's just it's trading stress for tension, and that's not much of a better trade. And I really think that the way that the game is built on stress really does well for Isaac, the protagonist, because you're in his shoes. You feel the way he does. The game doesn't try to scare you with necromorphs anymore. There's a few jump scares in the beginning, but it knows, especially if you played Dead Space 1, you're not afraid of the necromorphs anymore. By the end of Dead Space 1, the things that you would have thought to be unkillable flesh beasts you were mowing down by the dozens. You're not afraid of them anymore, and it knows that. Where Isaac is. That's where Isaac, the protagonist, is. At all points, he is just as stressed and just as upset about this as you. He quips, he talks now more than anything, which is such a good change. But he quips at you. He quips at his allies. He quips at the enemies. When he's stomping on things, he's no longer scared and just going, oh, right? He's screaming, fuck you, fuck this, like he's so annoyed and so stressed out. And I think that making the player be in the same position mentally and emotionally as the protagonist is something that all of the great games do, right? Every game that I can think of that's like one of the best of the best games, they do that. And I think Dead Space 2 does that with aplomb. And that's not even talking about the game design, right? The combat, the upgrades, the ammo economy, they all feel really finely tuned in this game. In Dead Space 1, famously in my first playthrough, I got stuck in a room for a really long time because I did not have the ammo for it, and I did not have the health items for it, and you were facing the regenerator, and it's just a real big problem. But in Dead Space 2, there was multiple times I was selling ammo because I had an overabundance of it, which sounds like, well, that's, you have too much then. But no, you need all of that ammo, or you need the money for the upgrades, because the hordes of the necromorphs are only going to get bigger, and they're only going to get tougher. It's interesting. Dead Space 1 was a game that was originally going to be like System Shock, but then when the developers saw Resident Evil 4, they were like, scrap everything, we need to make this. We need to make Resident Evil 4, but, you know, with our game. And I don't think they quite nailed it. I don't think they did. I think that it is a good game. Dead Space 1 is a good game, but it's a game that does not hit the Resident Evil 4 vibes quite as much. Dead Space 2 is a true successor to Resident Evil 4, genuinely. It has tight, good combat the same way Resident Evil 4 does. You feel mentally in the sort of the same place that the protagonist does. You know, in Resident Evil 4, you feel like this kind of strong badass who is a little in over his head, but is going to get through it because, you know, you've got resources and you can be smart about what's going on. Leon plays very tacticianly, if that's a word, by conserving his ammo to be able to kick the enemies and stomp them on the ground, or not stomp them, but knife them on the ground and that sort of thing. And Isaac does the same thing, right? Isaac uses environmental props to pin enemies to walls. Isaac uses that sort of thing to hurt the enemies around him. And I think that makes it really fun. It makes it really interesting to fight him, or to play as him and to fight as him. And I think that the combat and the ammo economy and everything else, they all feel so finely tuned in this way where it feels in some ways similar to the way Resident Evil 4 does, where you feel powerful, but you never feel so powerful that the game stops being stressful or scary. You never feel so powerful that the game doesn't kind of feel like you need to scrounge a little bit, right? Like you are just kind of, you're powerful, but really all it would take is like a few missed shots and suddenly you're not so powerful anymore. And you know, I think that's a really good design. That's a really good design philosophy that the game has. I think Nicole in this story is also really interesting as a bad guy because she's a really obvious bad guy. The whole time she's trying to fight you, she tries to make you kill yourself, she tries to make you, you know, stick the needle in your eye, all that other sort of stuff. And you don't trust her, neither does Isaac. But then there's a moment where Isaac accepts that he doesn't want to let her go, and she seemingly becomes friendly. She seemingly becomes on your side. But it's fun because then it almost becomes like a horror movie, which I think really fits the whole third person sort of one-shot take that the game has, where you're watching Isaac. You are not Isaac, you are watching Isaac. Because there are multiple moments where you're like, Isaac, no, stop. No, she's bad. She's leading you to the marker. Hey, Isaac, buddy, don't do that. And it feels a bit like you're screaming at the horror movie protagonist who just won't listen to you and just keeps going into danger. But you're controlling that protagonist and you have to watch the results of that. I think the first game tries to do this bait and switch with like Nicole is dead, right? The chapters spell it out. It's, you know, it tries to have it be this big reveal. But who didn't figure it out in the first 5 minutes? I mean, she's literally saying make us whole the whole time. Oh my y'all, but I've never had a girlfriend that just was like, hey babe, gonna pick up some bread from the store. Make us whole, by the way. Not a normal thing for your girlfriend to be saying. Pretty weird, pretty strange, especially when it's also written all over all the walls and everything. So rather than having to try any sort of fake out, the game says, okay, you know she's the bad guy, but Isaac doesn't. Or at least he's not willing to accept that she is. And I think using that to mentally sort of torture him for the whole game is so much more of an interesting story choice than, you know, what they did in Dead Space 1. But that's kind of the whole theme with Dead Space 2, is that in every way, everything that they did in Dead Space 1 is either expanded upon, made more interesting and fun, or just outright better. Yeah, I just think it's a fantastic game. I had a great time with it. Super, super, super fun. But anyway, that's gonna wrap it up, guys. Thanks so much for watching to the end, if you have. And hey, if you have any opinions on, you know, what I've said here, if you have anything that I've said here that you'd like to expound upon, leave a comment below. Let me know. I really genuinely love to talk about this stuff. So let me know your thoughts, let me know your feelings. If you disagreed with me and think I'm a shithead, tell me that too. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff, and I will see you guys next week for another Post-Mortem. Bye.